Global administrators are completely enraged at Donald Trump and his contemptible administration as the essential gathering that was anticipated to occur between Europe and the United States was terminated when Marco Rubio was a non-attendee and he communicated he possessed superior activities to execute. The objective of this gathering was to discuss about the collective protection of Ukraine, and Rubio was too fearful to even appear. Now, at the identical duration that gathering was terminated, you possessed European administrators like EU's International Strategy Administrator Kaja Kallas confronting United States Trump administration administrators to their countenance. Individuals like Mike Waltz and alternative individuals who were there from the Trump administration received identified and identity verified by European administrators and leaders, communicating if you believe that Europe is going to assist you when you proceed into these conflicts, if you're contemplating about Iran and alternative elements, you've received another element arriving. If you believe you're merely going to proceed it isolated, you recognize positive fortune proceeding it isolated, but we aren't going to be here to assist you. Observe as the EU's Kaja Kallas merely tears Mike Waltz to fragments. Here, execute this segment. What is genuinely the distinction? You recognize when, for illustration, Russia proceeds to conflict, they proceed isolated, because they don't possess supporters. When America proceeds to conflicts, then you recognize substantial of us proceed with you, and we forfeit our individuals on the approach. So that signifies that you also require us you recognize to be this dominant power, because if you examine at the more substantial representation, I signify in terms of financial influence, I signify China is an extremely influential nation. By the approach, she persists and communicates, including in the wilderness creatures cooperate, Trump including in the wilderness creatures cooperate. You recognize what she's designating Trump and Rubio and Waltz correct here to their countenance nonetheless. Here, execute this segment. And one might communicate that is accurate, that those who possess the authority have possessed distinct regulations, but including in wilderness, you recognize creatures cooperate, and so you are superior off when you operate with alternative individuals. Now, I believe a significant element that transpired at this Munich Protection Assembly was that a documentation was liberated correct ahead of the assembly that was established to occur, and they referenced Donald Trump. This is how the Munich Security Conference documentation of 2026 examines communicating Trump is the most prominent destruction individual of essentially the present decade, if not additional, naturally, and he's obliterating the global arrangement. Observe what they possessed to communicate here. Execute this segment. The yearly protection documentation liberated ahead of the assembly characterized President Trump as one of the most prominent destruction individuals when it arrives to global arrangement. Here's another quotation from that documentation, which is more than 80 periods following building initiated. The U.S.-guided post-1945 international arrangement is presently under obliteration. The German administrator merely communicated in Munich and stated this. You've selected a severe motto for this assembly under obliteration, and it presumably signifies that the international arrangement based on entitlements and regulations is presently being obliterated, but I'm concerned we have to position it in including more severe terms. This arrangement, as imperfect as it has been, including in its superior period, no extended exists. And then we received from President Zelensky of Ukraine, and naturally anticipated to be a significant gathering that Rubio, merely absent and didn't appear, was a non-attendee. So here Zelensky is out there communicating, observe, you recognize Donald Trump in America, continue communicating, we desire you to surrender. We desire you to surrender Ukraine. Zelensky is like, I've consented to surrender repeatedly and again, and I stated I'll execute this. I stated I'll execute this. Russia hasn't consented to execute anything. Russia hasn't, including consented to a fundamental ceasefire, and they've never consented to anything. Observe what Zelensky communicates here. Execute this segment. This is insane conflict of Russians opposed to merely individuals, and that's why it's It's not simple to cease because we cannot merely you recognize cease because Russians don't desire. And there are some indications from American aspect from President Trump. They communicate, observe, this is a duration for surrenders. You can render some progressions forward. We rendered substantial surrenders. Putin and his associates, they are not in detention. This is the most substantial surrender what the global rendered previously, and we positioned from the extremely beginning and protecting our independence and our existences, and we merely cannot disregard. You recognize, I believe, that everybody comprehend. We cannot disregard that they terminated so numerous individuals, but we are prepared. And when President Trump stated, let's merely execute ceasefire, merely you recognize suspended conflict and etc., and I stated affirmative. It's challenging, substantial inquiries to this concept. But President acceptable, we will back ceasefire, unconditional one. Putin declined affirmative naturally. Then Zelensky also indicates assume what I'm younger than Putin, and his intervals are arriving to a conclusion rapidly. In alternative statements, Putin's going to be deceased rapidly, and I'm going to be here. I'm not concerned to contact individuals' influences. I'm not concerned to be around categories of individuals. The approach Putin is, let's remember that. Execute this segment. I believe Putin also in a challenging position because I can communicate with you and contact influences, and I don't concerned, and I desire to be unrestricted, and I desire to transform, following governance, following everything. I desire you recognize, I desire to, and you're here. Affirmative. I'm here. You observe? Can you imagine? So I'm an unrestricted individual, and I believe that, and I'm younger than Putin, you recognize. Negative, consider me. This is significant. He doesn't possess too substantial duration, you recognize. Not too substantial duration. Affirmative, God favor. Not too substantial duration. And naturally, the identical approach you possessed Kaja Kallas positioning up to the Trump administration, you possessed Zelensky correct there positioning up to, you recognize Trump and alternative individuals when Trump correct before the Munich Security Conference occurred. Trump was like, Zelensky superior receive advancing. Russia desires to render a arrangement. What's transpiring there? Russia does not desire to Russia's never rendered any action ever to suggest it desires to render an arrangement. All you and Putin have been endeavoring to execute is render a fraudulent arrangement with each alternative over $12 trillion in fraudulent financial cooperation when Russia's complete GDP is $2 trillion a period. But here's what Trump stated. Execute this segment. Discussions. Do you still insist Zelensky have to maintain votes before summer? Well, Zelensky is going to have to receive advancing. Russia desires to render arrangement, and Zelensky is going to have to receive advancing alternatively. He's going to absent an excellent chance. He has to advance. If you're pressured about receiving out of obligation, it's proceed duration. Genuinely, this is one of those instances where sequence genuinely subjects. Done with debt is one of the superior I've observed at navigating obligation relief. 2025 was a documentation period. They registered exceeding $12 million in obligation for our audiences and alternative individuals. Here's why I'm informing you this presently. According to the Federal Reserve's recent survey, numerous financial institutions have constricted their standards. Presently might be your superior aperture to discuss resolutions before creditors constrict additionally. Done with debt monitors, credit identification, and advance organization conduct. They're experienced at recognizing who is discussing and when and what it requires to receive you the most substantial diminishment feasible. And whether you're transporting 10,000 or 500,000 in obligation, this might be the superior opportunity you'll receive all period. Do not pause for creditors to constrict up their strategies. Here's what you execute. Arrange a complimentary consultation. There's zero strain, and it exclusively requires a few moments. Distribute who you are obligated, and they'll inform you if this is the instance you could observe a substantial diminishment in your obligation. Imagine awakening fighting without that burden on your structures and executing it without accepting another advance or submitting for bankruptcy. Done with debt assists you through the obligation relief procedure, so you maintain more of your compensation each period. Proceed to donewithdebt.com immediately. That's donewithdebt.com. And then in this Munich Protection Assembly, we observed substantial leaders positioning up, whether it was French President Emmanuel Macron, whether it was Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, whether it was Zelensky, whether it was Kallas, whether it was Stubb and alternative individuals. Here's what French President Macron possessed to communicate. Execute this segment in sequence, though, to be substantially more independent. But when I communicate about Europe transforming a authority, I don't communicate about France or Germany transforming a authority. I communicate about Europe, so we have to contemplate and function as Europeans. I would communicate by creation, and this is what we have to execute presently. And if this duration of realignment is a duration of disintegrations of separation or national authority, it would be an enormous error. Additional from Macron correct here. Europe has to acquire to transform a geopolitical authority. It was not component of our genetic composition. We conceived ourselves as a governmental building to furnish peace. We transmitted. Subsequently, a solitary exchange to furnish expansion and prosperity. We transmitted. Presently, we have to reform it in this new arrangement. In this new geopolitical climate, Europe has to transform a geopolitical authority. It's continuing, but we have to hasten and unmistakably to transmit all the components of geopolitical authority. One additional segment from French President Emmanuel Macron. Let's execute it. But let's communicate about our of assignment behind sealed entrances. And let's transmit, but let's furnish a favorable representation of ourselves, and let's be satisfied of ourselves, because this is what our companion citizens require. And here's what Germany Chancellor Merz has to communicate. And he stated, "Observe, our nation, Germany in the 20th century, we descended isolated. We executed it, this approach, essentially the approach the U.S. is executing it presently. And that was a terrible error in the 20th century. Execute this segment, we Germans recognize. A global in which influence renders correct would be an obscure location. Our nation has descended this route in the 20th century until the severe and terrible conclusion. Today, we initiate on a superior route. Additional from Germany's Chancellor Merz. Correct here. Let's execute it." If there had been a unipolar instance following the collapse of the Berlin Barrier, a unipolar instance in Chronicle, it has exceeded. The United States' assertion to guidance has been opposed and potentially forfeited, and here's what he possessed to communicate as well. Let's execute this segment correct here. What was fascinating too, as you possessed Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, discussing about separating from the United States, that Europe requires to merely completely transform, not reliant whatsoever on the U.S. Examine elsewhere. If the U.S. desires to be separated, permit him be separated. But you possessed the U.S. NATO representative Matt Whitaker there at the Munich Security Conference, and he was questioned by the moderator. What's your reply to the German Chancellor discussing about separating? In alternative statements, merely eliminating the United States completely because the U.S. is aggressive. It's adversarial, and observe how timid Whitaker is. He's like, "Oh, you recognize that's merely what the consideration containers are communicating?" And then the moderator is like, "That's not the consideration container. That's the administrator of Germany communicating that." And Whitaker's like, "Oh, that's not going to transpire. It transpired previously. It's concluded because of you and Trump and your contemptible administration of authoritarians here. Let's execute it." I received distracted by the complete chancellor element. Do you concern that what you recognize the Chancellor Merz stated that essentially you recognize we're going to separate? I signify, are we going to separate from we're not? Negative, we're not. The US and Europe. Negative. And I believe this is a category of a consideration container, category of theoretical. I oppose on this each solitary interval. You recognize, this is a German chancellor that stated this. It's not a consideration container. I didn't communicate he was flawless. I merely stated he's superior. And while the Munich Security Conference was occurring, and Marco Rubio was too occupied to including appear at the principal Ukraine gathering. So the gathering was abruptly terminated. What was Donald Trump executing? He was communicating at Fort Liberty in North Carolina and discussing about how he doesn't appreciate stealth vessels because they appear unattractive, and he desires to introduce back World War II battleships and authorize those instead of stealth vessels and instead of aircraft transporters. And while Donald Trump was accepting his journey to and from North Carolina, he maintained a media assembly where he discussed about administration transformation in Iran. Let's execute it. Do you desire this transformation in Iran? Well, it appears like that would be the superior element that could transpire. For 47 periods, they've been discussing and discussing and discussing. In the interim, we've forfeited substantial existences while they discuss, and limbs eliminated off, structures eliminated off, countenances eliminated off. It's been continuing for an extended duration. So let's observe what transpires. In the interim, we possess substantial authority has materialized, and supplementary authority as you recognize an alternative transporters proceeding out. And a journalist stated, though, I'm perplexed. You stated, Donald, that you completely obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities previous June. So, if you completely obliterated it, why are you communicating that you require them to cease the program? You stated you obliterated it. What? Obliteration? And then you and the administration received irritated and assaulted anyone who didn't communicate or who stated it wasn't obliterated. So I assume you were fabricating back then, correct? Here's what Donald Trump stated. Aspect that the Iranian nuclear locations have been completely obliterated. What's remaining to proceed following? Well, you could receive whatever the particles is down there. That's genuinely the minimum of the operation. If we execute it, that would be the minimum of the operation. But you recognize we presumably grasp whatever's remaining. It has been obliterated as you recognize. Additional from French President Emmanuel Macron communicating Europe presently requires nuclear prevention. Europe requires to construct up its nuclear arsenal. You observe what Donald Trump has executed to the complete global arrangement here. Execute this segment. We are conceiving, and in few periods duration I will specify that. We participated a calculated dialogue, obviously with Chancellor Merz, but with few European administrators in sequence, to observe how we can express our national doctrine, which is assured and managed by the Constitution, with particular cooperation, common implementations, and common protection concerns with some essential nations. This is precisely what we are executing for the initial duration in Chronicle with Germany. And I believe this dialogue is significant by itself, but it's significant because this is an approach to express nuclear prevention in a comprehensive approach of protection and protection. And this is an approach to generate convergence in our calculated approach and calculated civilization between Germany and France. And here's what Finnish President Stubb has to communicate. Let's execute it. Then we have to question ourselves the inquiry for demographic justifications, for financial justifications, for geopolitical justifications. It's going to be the global South that determines the subsequent global arrangement. And then ultimately, you possess, in reply to Kaja Kallas, the EU International Strategy Administrator, you possessed the U.S. representative to the UN, Mike Waltz. He communicates we require to reform multilateralism. I believe that that's what we should execute. This is terminology when he communicates we require to reform multilateralism. Do you all remember the recordings I rendered previous January 2025, not January 2026, January 2025, when Marco Rubio discussed about reforming multilateralism to communicate the center's multipolar global requires to be the US, Russia, and China, three centers characterizing multilateralism who divide up the global, which I cautioned, I stated that signifies what the U.S. is communicating. Europe belongs to Russia, the Western territory belongs to the U.S., and all of Asia belongs to China. That's the Trump administration's perspective. Everything is through that framework. And here Waltz is once again communicating that let's execute this segment. So I merely, if you concentrate on the realities and the outcomes, and if we have to reform multilateralism that hasn't been reformed, honestly, in 80 periods, then I believe that should be accepted by the global. So that's what's transpiring presently at the Munich Security Conference. Permit me recognize what you believe. Naturally, impact subscribe, assist us receive to 6 million followers. We're thankful for all of your backing and appreciation so substantially for observing. Appreciate this recording? Back independent information and access exclusive material. Advertisement complimentary recordings and personalized symbols by transforming a compensated participant of our YouTube platform today. You can also present memberships to alternative individuals. Let's continue expanding collectively.